Truth in My Days podcast is sponsored by the Truth in My Days ministry. Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello, this is Dr. Adrienne Torres. I am here with Truth in My Days director John Torres to continue discussing the truth of the resurrection of Jesus. As we have seen, the resurrection is the linchpin of the Christian faith. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then, as even the Bible itself says, our faith is useless. But if he did rise from the dead, then he proved his claims and his ability to beat death for us by beating it for himself, something no other religious leader has ever done. Not Muhammad, not Buddha, not Krishna, no other than Jesus. Now, John, you have been taking us through arguments for the resurrection. That is, arguments to believe that the resurrection actually happened. You took us through some arguments that are commonly used, but as you pointed out, are not good arguments. And also through 7 powerful arguments that do support the fact of the resurrection. What's next?
Well, we are going to look at alternate explanations for the resurrection. If it becomes impossible to deny that some sort of resurrection took place, the last gambit that skeptics have is to argue that, yes, there was a quote-unquote resurrection, but it was not Jesus actually coming back from the dead, but some other phenomenon.
Yes, I guess they must resort to that.
We're going to go through 14 of these, 14 alternate explanations. Some are, or at least were, common, and some are very fringe ideas, held to by very few, but they do illustrate how desperate skeptics can get to avoid facing the reality of God in Christ, that they would hold even to these really far out ideas rather than facing the fact that Jesus rose from the dead.
14 sounds interesting. What's the first?
The first would be the scam theory, and this would seem reasonable on the face of it because there have been many religious scams in history. Many people have in the past used religion posed as some kind of leader, faith healer, prophet, for the purpose of gaining power, gaining wealth, or some combination of these things. So on the face of it, the idea to look at first that this was simply a scam is not unreasonable. But there's so many insurmountable problems with trying to present the resurrection of Jesus as a scam. We would first have to ask who perpetrated the scam. And there's really only one candidate, and that would be the disciples, because they were the ones who made the claim in the first place. But then we'd have to ask, why would they make these false claims? As we've pointed out elsewhere, they expected the Messiah, like the Jews of the first century, they expected the Messiah was going to come and deliver them from the Romans and usher in a heavenly kingdom. And this is why they followed Jesus. Now, if he died and he stayed dead, then he was not the Messiah. He was a fake. And just like others of around his time, Judas of Galilee, Theudas mentioned in Acts chapter 5, they would not follow him. They would not make up lies about a resurrection. They would not say that he rose from the dead and you should believe him, because being the ones who made up the lie, they would know it's a lie. They would know that Jesus could not deliver on these promises. So that's why nobody else, not the followers of Muhammad or Buddha or Krishna, ever made the claim that their follower rose from the dead. So the disciples, right off the bat, would not want to do such a thing. So in that case, what is the motive? Do they have another motive? Well, if they gained something, you could say they had a motive. If they gained money out of this, if they gained power, they had some kind of cynical motive, lying for gain, you could say, okay, maybe it was a scam. Maybe they were lying. But they didn't get these things. They got only suffering as a result. Acts chapter 12, verses 1 to 2, we read, "Now about that time, Herod the king stretched out his hand to harass some from the church. Then he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword." In 2 Corinthians 11, 24 to 28, we read, "From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been in the deep, in journeys often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. Besides the other things, what comes upon me daily, my deep concern for the churches. So again, you have to ask, this is what they were getting. And in fact, their message didn't allow them to get anything more than that. They were passing on Jesus' message, which said, turn the other cheek, love your enemies, men will hate you for my sake. Nothing that would allow them to gain wealth or power or anything that we would think of as a motive for a religious scam. And that's not the only problem with this scam theory. It's not only that they had no motive, but if they did do it, if for whatever reason they decided to lie, how long could it possibly last? Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, written a good 20 years later, talks about over 500 brethren at once had seen the risen Jesus. How exactly could they persuade so many to go along with the scam? And apparently, this eyewitness challenge, if it were not met, then Christianity would have fallen apart, means that 20 plus years later, these 500 brethren, those who remain of them, are still willing to testify they saw the risen Jesus, which they could not have seen if this was a scam. So why are they doing it? After 20 plus years of persecution, why would so many go along with the scam, especially to promote a Messiah that they know cannot save them? And when the persecutions did start, which was almost immediate, should we think that not even one of them would admit it was a scam to save his own life, to end the persecution, possibly even to curry favor with the Romans? Not even one of them admitted it was a scam in 20 plus years? That does not seem at all plausible.
Well, I see there's no logic to the scam theory at all. To perpetrate a scam, there has to be gain. There's no gain for them, only suffering. And I'm totally with you on this. There's no way the scam could explain the resurrection of Jesus.
Exactly. Now, the second attempted alternate explanation for the resurrection is the stolen body theory. And this is the idea that somebody removed the body of Jesus from the tomb somewhere between the crucifixion and his burial, sometime between then and when the women came to the tomb Sunday morning. Somebody removed the body, and so when the women came and then the disciples came, they saw an empty tomb, and they concluded that Jesus had risen from the dead. But again, there are problems here. First, we would have to ask, who stole the body? Would it be the disciples themselves? Well, then we're back to the problems that we listed for the first alternate explanation, which is they had no motive to do it. And we've gone through why they have no motive to do it. So it wouldn't be the disciples. More often, the theory posits somebody else did it and fooled the disciples. So if it's not the disciples, who? The only ones left are the enemies of Jesus. Which ones? Would it be the Jewish leadership? No. That would be the last thing they would do. The last thing they wanted was for people to believe in the resurrection. In Matthew 27, verses 62 to 64, we read this. On the next day, which followed the day of preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees gathered together to Pilate, saying, Sir, we remember when he was still alive how that deceiver said, after 3 days I will rise. Therefore, command that the tomb be made secure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away and say to the people, he has risen from the dead. So the last deception will be worse than the first. And you see here, they're very desperate not to let the body out of the tomb. They're very desperate to make sure nobody got the idea that Jesus rose from the dead. This is why they asked Pilate to seal the tomb. The answer was to seal, not to steal. The body had to stay in the tomb. If it were gone, then this idea could spread that maybe Jesus did rise from the dead, the very idea they wanted to prevent. So there's no way they would steal the body. Well, if it was not the Jewish leaders, what about the Roman leaders? No, they would have no motive either. Job number one for the governor of a province in the Roman Empire was to keep the peace. That was his first job, keep the people pacified so that the tax money would keep flowing into Rome. This is, in fact, why Pilate hesitated about the execution of Jesus. Pilate, we know from Josephus, had twice already infuriated the Jewish population and almost caused an uprising. And he seemed to understand if it happened a third time, he would be recalled in disgrace to Rome. So he was very, very eager not to set one off. And so when Jesus was brought to him, he didn't know which he should do, which was more likely to cause a riot or an uprising, killing Jesus or letting him go. Finally, he decided, not surprisingly considering how the crowds were acting, he decided that the safe way to go was to execute Jesus. And he did that. His followers did not rise up. They were beaten. They were defeated. The last thing Pilate would want to do, or any of the Romans, would be to stir them up by letting them believe Jesus had actually risen from the dead. So no, they had no reason to steal the body either. And that leaves nobody with a motive. Another problem with this theory is that the empty tomb didn't convince anyone. This is why we've said before that it's a poor argument. It did not convince the women who came to the tomb, did not convince the disciples themselves. Simple empty tomb cannot convince somebody of a resurrection. Any kind of explanation for an empty tomb other than somebody rising from the dead would seem more convincing. As we said, the thing that did persuade the disciples was Jesus appearing to them alive. Again, the post-resurrection appearances. And this particular approach that the body was stolen from the tomb simply does not explain the post-resurrection appearances. So it's not an adequate alternate theory. A third one, called is the eaten body theory. And this has been promoted by the scholar John Dominic Crossan in his book, Jesus, A Revolutionary Biography. And he says simply that Jesus was killed and his body was probably eaten by wild dogs. Crossan claims that the Romans left crucifixion victims on the cross to be eaten by crows and wild dogs. They would not have given the body to Joseph of Arimathea. If they did not leave him on the cross and buried him at all, it would have been done by the Roman soldiers in a very shallow grave, and the body would have been dug up and eaten by dogs.
So basically, they're throwing out the biblical record that Jesus was taken down, and Joseph of Arimathea buried him, and the Roman guards and all that. They have to throw out all of that to say that the body was eaten by dogs.
Oh, indeed. Liberal skeptics do not take the gospel book seriously, and this is why it's incumbent upon us as Christian apologists to drive home the point that indeed they are, by all historical tests, absolutely reliable, and any kind of argument that simply rules them out is not acceptable. And we have to be more forceful about that point. Too many apologists give too much ground on these things. Nevertheless, this argument seems a little more clever at first and a little more difficult for Christians to deal with, because this actually gets rid of the body. And so that argument that if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, why didn't the authorities produce the body? That argument becomes stymied. But it's a moot point because, as we've seen before, it's a poor argument anyway, not one we should be using. There are, in fact, many other reasons why this argument of Crossan's fails utterly. Now, first, it is true that crucifixion victims may indeed have been thrown to the dogs or left on the cross or put in shallow graves in other parts of the Roman Empire. But it was not the case among the Jews. The first century AD historian Josephus, whom we've mentioned before, he tells us this in his book, War of the Jews, section 4.5.2. The Jews used to take so much care of the burial of men that they took down those that were condemned and crucified and buried them before the going down of the sun. So Crossan's pontifications from 20 centuries later, that the Romans would have just thrown the body away, would not have been buried, is confuted by simple historical facts here. And what Josephus in the first century records of Jews doing in the first century trumps any kind of bloviations from Crossan so much later. Furthermore, point two, we have evidence that what Josephus said is true. In 1968, archaeologists discovered the remains of a crucified man with the nails still in the heel bone inside an ossuary, a burial box. Remember that in the period from about AD 1 to AD 70, the burial practice of the Jews was to take the body of the dead person, wrap the body in linens, store them inside a tomb with a stone in front of it, leave the body there for about a year until the flesh had rotted away completely. They would go back then after a year and take the bones and put them into a stone box, usually with the name of the person inscribed on the box. These were called ossuaries. So the fact that the remains of a crucifixion victim was inside an ossuary proves that, in fact, this crucifixion victim was properly buried according to Jewish traditions, and even the remains put into the ossuary a year later. And that confirms that crucifixion victims in Judea were buried and gives the lie to Crossan's attempt to get around that. Third point, we have the eyewitness testimonies in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And these tell us that Jesus was buried in a tomb after his crucifixion and not thrown to dogs. And eyewitness testimony trumps liberal scholars' speculations from 20 centuries later. The fifth point about this is that the local population would have known if crucifixion victims were thrown to the dogs. They would have known that Jesus' body had just been eaten. And if that were the case, when the apostles started preaching the resurrection, the populace would have just laughed him to scorn. They would have known the body was gone. They would have known that no resurrection was possible. Christianity would never have gotten started. If anybody had been foolish enough even to preach such a thing in the first place, it would never have gotten started. Yet here it is today, 20 centuries later, which means, as the Bible says, people believed the message, which means they knew that the body had not been eaten by dogs. And the sixth point on this, once again, this does not account for the post-resurrection appearances. If Jesus' body had been thrown to dogs and eaten, then why would the apostles have believed that he rose from the dead? Why would they claim they had seen him? Okay. This is what convinced them, not the empty tomb, the post-resurrection appearances. So this idea from Crossan that Jesus' body was thrown to the dogs, eaten by the dogs, it doesn't meet the standard of bare possibility. It's just a silly idea that needs to be rejected. The next theory that we're going to look at is what's called the swoon theory. And the swoon theory posits that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. He was crucified and he swooned. He went unconscious and the people thought that he was dead. They removed him from the cross. They laid him in the tomb. And while he was in there, the cool of the tomb revived him, and he managed to get out and return to his disciples who believed he'd risen from the dead. This theory was very popular in the 19th century, but it was gradually all but abandoned because it's simply too implausible, they thought. How does a man who's nearly dead, who's wrapped in 100 pounds of spices and tightly wrapped inside these linens, out of which he could not extricate himself. We know that from Lazarus. When Lazarus was raised and he came out, they needed someone to unwrap him. How does a man who's nearly dead, who's been flogged, who's been scourged, who's been crucified and wrapped us, how does he get out? How does he manage to push aside that huge stone and then appear to his disciples and convince them that he had actually risen from the dead? It seems so implausible that few skeptics go this route anymore. That doesn't mean they think the resurrection is more plausible than this. It just means they think they need a better alternative. But no better one actually has come up. So some are moving back to this. In my debate last year with Shabir Ali, this is the route that he went. So let's look at this swoon theory. Is it viable? First question, of course, could a man survive crucifixion? Could a victim survive crucifixion? And we might be tempted to say yes. Josephus, the Jewish historian from the first century, recounts an incident in which he intervenes with Titus, the emperor, for 3 acquaintances of his who had been crucified. And they were immediately taken down from the cross and given the best medical care. 2 of them died and 1 recovered, and that's in his book Vita, section 76. But this is not really parallel to Jesus. He was not given the best medical care at all. And more importantly, these acquaintances of Josephus were still obviously alive and kicking on the cross. Otherwise, there would have been no point for Josephus to intervene. When they were taken down, they did not look dead, whereas Jesus certainly at minimum looked dead. So this case is not really relevant to our question. The next thing we have to ask is, could the Roman soldiers have mistakenly thought Jesus was dead? In the case of Josephus' friends, they were supposed to remove them from the cross. They were supposed to take them to the best medical care. In the case of Jesus, they were not to remove him from the cross. They were to be sure that he was dead. Some skeptics say they could possibly have been mistaken. They point to an incident that happened in Lystra when Paul was preaching there. And we read in Acts chapter 14, verses 19 to 28, then Jews from Antioch and Iconium came there, and having persuaded the multitudes, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. However, when the disciples gathered around him, he rose up and went into the city. On this basis, they say that, well, perhaps the soldiers mistook Jesus for dead. The problem with that argument is that while, yes, these people did mistake Paul for dead, these were untrained amateurs, farmers, shopkeepers, craftsmen, and so on. They were not trained professional killers like the Roman soldiers who were tasked with ensuring that victims did not survive. So this point also seems irrelevant to our question, because our question is really, could Jesus have survived the crucifixion? And the answer to this is an emphatic no, because in addition to what we have already seen about the swoon theory and the eyewitness testimony in the gospel books that he was dead, there is this. And the question is how crucifixion kills. What are the effects of being nailed to the cross? Well, it has many very negative effects on the human body. On the respiratory system, it causes shallow breathing, hypoxia, and eventually asphyxiation. On the cardiovascular system, it causes cardiac ischemia, tachycardia from hypoxia and dehydration, myocardial infarction, congestive heart failure, pleural effusion, and cardiac rupture and tamponade. So death is caused how? Well, in one of 3 ways. The heart failure combined with pleural effusion that leads to respiratory arrest and cardiac arrest, heart attack, or a myocardial infarction, a heart attack with tamponade leading to cardiac arrest, asphyxiation. These are the 3 possibilities. And in each case, while the victim is there dying, plasma is being extravasated into the pleural and pericardial sacs around the lungs and around the heart. And they build up. It builds up this fluid around the heart and lungs. So there are 2 reasons that we know Jesus could not have survived the crucifixion. First, we read this and we notice it from the eyewitnesses in John 19, 31 to 35. Therefore, because it was the preparation day, that the bodies should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. Then the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who were crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs, but one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. And he who has seen has testified, and his testimony is true. And he knows that he is telling the truth so that you may believe. Well, what is the significance of this? It means the spear pierced the pleural and pericardial sacs and the heart. That's how blood and water comes out, which means he was certainly dead. You cannot stick a spear into somebody's heart and have him survive. Now, faced with this, skeptics who desperately want to hold on to the swoon theory claim that this never happened. But the reality is we have seen that this is eyewitness testimony. And so opponents, those who want to say that this didn't happen, have to give some kind of countervailing evidence as to why we should not believe the testimony here. And these skeptics never do offer any evidence. At most, they will say something like, scholars have found that, scholarly consensus, but this is not actual evidence. So that's one reason we can be sure that Jesus was dead. There is a second, and this is the fact that when a victim is nailed to the cross, the respiration must become active. In other words, because of the way the arms are stretched, his position on the cross, he has to keep pushing himself up to breathe. So if he swoons, that is, he goes unconscious, he can't do that. He can't push himself up to breathe, which means either the lack of oxygen will force him to wake up and continue the process so he does not look dead, or he stays unconscious, in which case he will not breathe and he will die. And if he dies, he dies. And if he swoons, he dies. Either way, he's dead. So Jesus died on the cross, and that rules out any sort of swoon theory.
Well, so I think that there's actually no way argue that Jesus did not die. If he did not die from the horrendous treatment he had on the cross with heart failure and with water in the lungs and with blood surrounding the heart, compressing the heart muscles so the heart cannot beat, then surely the spear is going to kill him. And I believe that they did not break his legs because he was already dead, so they don't have to make him dead. And then the spear is just to make sure. Is that right?
Indeed. That was the whole point of breaking the legs, because at that point, the person would not be able to push himself up to breathe anymore and he would die. So you would agree that for certain he was dead. And you're a medical doctor, that's your professional opinion?
Yes, and not just mine. If you look into the death of Jesus, there are many doctors attesting how it is impossible for Jesus to have survived the crucifixion based on the facts recorded in the gospel. In order to argue otherwise, you basically have to throw out the historical documents, which is the eyewitness testimony in the gospel.
Yes, there's actually one excellent article on that written by Dr. William D. Edwards called On the Physical Death of Jesus Christ, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, volume 255 in 1986. So anyone who's interested in the medical details really should check that out. So the swoon theory doesn't work. Let's go on to the fifth theory they offer, the hallucination theory. And that's self-explanatory. The idea is that Jesus' followers had hallucinations. Jesus never rose from the dead. He stayed dead. But the disciples believed that he had risen. They saw things that they took to be the risen Jesus, but simply were in their own mind. This hallucination theory is promoted by liberal scholars, including Michael Goulder and Gerhard Ludemann. Goulder suggests that Peter had a hallucination caused by extreme grief. When he thought Jesus rose from the dead, he told the others, and that ended up leading to a mass delusion. Ludemann ascribes it to guilt feelings in Peter and Paul.
Is that a reasonable theory?
Well, it might sound that way at first glance, but when you dig into it, it falls apart. First, hallucinations take place in one's mind, which means they have no correspondence to actual external reality. And that makes them completely unique to the person having it. Different people do not hallucinate the same thing at the same time. And particularly, they do not hallucinate the same things in different groups at different times in different places and across extended time periods. I remember that Jesus appeared to the disciples across a period of 40 days in many different circumstances, offering infallible proofs that he'd risen. They touched him, they ate with him, they did these kind of things that you can't do with a hallucination. And so the post-resurrection appearances really cannot be explained away as hallucinations.
What else?
Well, as we've pointed out, there have been through history more than 50 Jewish messiahs, 50 people claiming the role of Jewish messiah, and countless other religious leaders throughout history had devout followers who, when their leaders were killed or died, must have had grief and or guilt feelings, yet none of them ever hallucinated a resurrection, let alone made it convincing enough to found a faith that lasted almost 2,000 years now.
Well, I would like to add that just because you have guilt feelings, it is really not a precursor to having hallucinations. People feel guilty, they may be depressed, but it does not lead necessarily to hallucination. And most times, I think it does not.
Yes, I suppose we could point out that people like Goulder and Ludeman are biblical scholars. They're not medical doctors, they're not psychiatrists, they're not psychologists. So their opinions of what could have caused hallucination probably really shouldn't be taken all that seriously.
Anything else?
Well, consider these passages. Matthew 14:26. This is where Jesus was walking on the sea, and we read, "And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, 'It is a ghost.'" And then in Luke 24:36-37, when the risen Jesus appeared to his disciples, we read, "Jesus himself stood in the midst of them, but they were terrified and frightened and supposed they had seen a spirit." So it seems pretty clear that even if they had had a hallucination of Jesus, they wouldn't have thought that Jesus rose from the dead. They would have thought it was a ghost, not a resurrected person. So the bottom line here is that the hallucination theory is a desperate gambit that simply does not accord with what we know about hallucinations and about the facts of the case.
But wait, you said people's hallucinations are personal, so people don't share the same hallucinations.
That is what the experts say.
But what about the so-called apparitions of the Virgin Mary to large numbers of people? Were those examples of mass hallucinations?
There are skeptics who do use the supposed Marian apparitions to try to undermine the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. Dr. Hector Avalos, for example, who posted an online article called "Jesus, Resurrection and Marian Apparitions, Medjugorje as a Living Laboratory," to which, by the way, there is a detailed response on our website. Medjugorje was the site where some of the most famous apparitions took place. But this attempt to compare the two doesn't work. And that's because there are crucial differences between the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus and the supposed Marian apparitions.
What are these differences?
First, let's note that the supposed appearances at Medjugorje began with some personal appearances to 6 specific witnesses. And unlike the apostles, these 6 witnesses had no cost to what they were saying. There was no persecution of them. On the contrary, they profited rather handsomely from these claims, which already raises the possibility of a profit motive in making these claims, which didn't exist with the apostles. And secondly, there are contradictions and actual deceptions in their accounts.
Such as?
There are many of them. One example, one of the witnesses claimed the appearances, that she'd been told by Mary that the appearances would end after 3 more visits. And when they didn't, when Mary kept showing up, she denied ever having said it in the first place. But it had actually been recorded. And when she was told that it was recorded, then she said, "Oh, I don't remember saying that. If it was recorded, I must have said that." Another example, these seers, these 6 witnesses, were supposed to be in a state of ecstasy when Mary was there talking to them. They were supposedly in this state where they were completely oblivious to all sensations, physical sensations, of anything around them. They were completely unaware of what was going on. And yet, one time when they were in this supposed state of ecstasy, they didn't know what's going on around them. One person there out as if he was going to poke one of the witnesses in the eye, and she instantly jumped back. And when that happened, she was supposed to not know and not see anything around her. She can't know that this guy's poking her eye, but she jumped back. And immediately she was hustled out of the room by her handler. And they returned later, apparently having made up a cover story where she claimed that she'd seen baby Jesus slipping out of Mary's hands and jumped to catch him. And the problem with that, of course, is that then she should have been jumping forward, not backward. So you have these kind of problems that you don't find in the gospel accounts. Now, some other problems. The appearances of Mary always take place in the same location with the same witnesses. This supposed Mary never attempts to prove that she's physically present. At most, the witnesses claim they touched her robe, but they also described it as metal, which means if they were touching anything, they were touching a piece of metal and thinking it was her robe. Now, these are the Medjugorje appearances. There are the supposed appearances of Mary to crowds. But the problem here is this large numbers of people, some of whom say, yes, we see Mary, but many others at the same place at the same time saying, nope, there's nothing there. Another problem is Mary always appears at a distance. And here's a big problem. The apostles knew Jesus. So they knew him intimately. They spent time with him. So when the risen Jesus appears to them, they know who it is. But none of these people to whom Mary supposedly appears ever knew her. So how could they know that it was her? One witness described Mary as a blue-eyed, rosy-cheeked girl, which happened to exactly match the picture that was on display in her church for a long time before this happened. There's really no chance that the actual Mary looked like that at all. So why does the Mary who appeared look like that? Or why does she claim it looks like that? Because she already has this idea in her mind. So the Marian apparitions they're phony from start to finish, and they are in no way comparable to Jesus' post-resurrection appearances.
So are you saying that in these Mary apparitions, in the group of people who are there, only some of them claim to have seen Mary, and other people in the actual same place, same time, saw nothing?
It depends on the appearance. With these 6 witnesses, they're by themselves, they all claim to have seen her. And then, as we pointed out, though, there's certain dishonesties in their testimony, which puts the whole thing in doubt. There are other ones where the supposedly appearances of Mary to massive numbers of people standing on a hill at a distance, and a large number of people are there. And yes, in those cases, there are people who say, yeah, we see her. And I said, no, there's nothing there.
What other alternate theories for the resurrection are there?
The 6th one we'll look at is the so-called spiritual vision theory. And in this theory, Jesus never rose physically. He rose in some kind of spiritual sense, which might mean that he appeared as a spirit to them, or even just that they determined that they would carry on his teachings. This is the explanation for the resurrection.
So no physical resurrection at all, and that means the tomb should not be empty.
That's right. That's right. There's just absolutely nothing, I think, to this theory. It seems to me to be a complete failure. The gospel writers are very careful, repeatedly, to make it clear that the risen Jesus was physically present, bodily present. He was not just a spirit. That passage we saw in Luke 24, where he appeared to them and they think that it's a spirit. And he says, I'm not a spirit. I have touched me. I have flesh and bones. Spirits don't have these. He invited people to touch him. They're still not sure. He asks for some food to eat. Ghosts don't eat. In John 20, 24 to 29, after Jesus had appeared to the apostles, Thomas had not been present. And we read in this passage, now Thomas, called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said to him, we have seen the Lord. So he said to them, unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. And after 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, "Peace to you." Then he said to Thomas, "Reach your finger here and look at my hands, and reach your hand here and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing." And Thomas answered and said to him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." So it's very clear and undeniable that he was physically present. They touched him. They put their fingers into the holes, that hole in the side where the Roman spear went in, the holes in the wrists and the feet where the nails had gone, and he ate with them and so on. And furthermore, Jesus' own proof of his authenticity was that he would rise bodily. We see that in John chapter 2, verses 18 to 22. So anything less than that would not have been acceptable to the disciples. So here's the thing. You can't touch a vision. You can't eat with a vision. And as we said, that was Jesus' proof, a bodily resurrection.
That's obvious.
Yes.
And we must ask why the disciples would even want to carry on Jesus' teachings when he died and stayed dead, proving he was a false Messiah. They wouldn't they?
No, they wouldn't. They would have no reason to do that.
So what's the next theory?
The next theory, number 7, is the legend or myth theory. And that is that Jesus was an ordinary man. He was a preacher, teacher, had followers. He died like anybody else and was buried. And there was no claim that he rose from the dead, not immediately. But as time went by, as the decades went on, the original eyewitnesses died off. Eventually, these kind of legends began to develop around the character of Jesus, up to the point where they even invented this idea that he had risen from the dead. And it was to allow for this very thing that liberal scholars used to try to push the dating of the gospel books very, very late. Because if they were written long after the eyewitnesses were dead, the story could have grown in the telling. And that is why liberal scholars pushed, without any evidence, mind you, pushed the idea that the earliest gospel book was published 100 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. But this approach has fallen on hard times. As we mentioned elsewhere, manuscript discoveries in the 20th century showed that all of the gospel books were published within the first century. Liberal skeptics generally accept this now. Very few of them would question it. But if they were all published in the first century, then they were all published in eyewitness times, which means any sort of legends that somebody might have proposed would have been debunked by these eyewitnesses. The actual dates of the gospel books makes this claim of legendary development thoroughly impossible. And furthermore, we know from the Roman historian Tacitus that the brutal and deadly Roman persecutions against the Christians started in the year AD 64. Now, according to the legend theory, the myth theory, at this time, the idea that Jesus had risen from the dead had not yet been created. So what exactly were the Christians dying for? What were they preaching? What was objectionable? Why were they giving up their lives for somebody who was just an ordinary preacher who died like anybody else and stayed dead? So this just does not make sense.
True, it doesn't make sense at all. What's the next theory?
Number 8, the wrong tomb theory, which simply says that when the women went to anoint Jesus' body, they got the tomb wrong. They went to a different tomb that happened to be empty, and that convinced them Jesus had risen. The disciples then went out, saw the empty tomb. They all thought Jesus was risen.
What about Peter running to check to see if what the women said were true?
Well, yes, they all went out to check. They all went to the wrong tomb. Peter was not present when Jesus was buried. So when the women said, "This is the tomb," they just assumed that it was, accepted it. And so that's what convinced them Jesus rose. They all saw an empty tomb, mistakenly thinking it was Jesus' tomb, although it wasn't.
As you pointed out, the empty tomb didn't convince anyone. It was the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus that convinced the disciples. And there are no post-resurrection appearances according to this theory.
Well, exactly. That's one of the things that makes it a non-starter. If there are no post-resurrection appearances, nobody would believe that Jesus rose from the dead.
So what's the next theory?
We go on to number 9, which I call the swoon theory number 2. Return of the swoon theory. This one is not held by many people, but the idea here was that there was a plan to fake the resurrection. Jesus would be crucified, but the conspirators would remove him from the cross before he died, nurse him back to health to convince people that he'd risen. But the plan went awry. They did not foresee that a Roman soldier would actually stick a spear into Jesus' side, thereby actually killing him. And so they took the body, and the body was gone. They couldn't get the post-resurrection appearances because Jesus had unintentionally been killed. But still, with the empty tomb, this would have convinced people.
So that's just like another steal the body theory.
It is not steal the body theory with this added feature that it was planned.
I see. Well, that's just ridiculous.
Yes, because first they have to posit that there was this conspiracy. They have no evidence for that. Why should we believe that anybody had a conspiracy? There's absolutely no reason for it. And of course, if the plan did go awry when the Roman soldiers stabbed Jesus, we're back to the intractable problem that there are no post-resurrection appearances. So you see here how the theories are becoming more and more desperate and far-fetched.
I see a lot of your explanation to debunk these theories has to base on the fact that the empty tomb by itself cannot convince people that Jesus rose from the dead, and that we actually have to have the post-resurrection appearances to convince anybody at all.
Yes, I covered that in our discussion of poor arguments for the resurrection. The tomb was empty, no question about it. But as we pointed out, the empty tomb didn't convince Mary Magdalene. It didn't convince the women. It didn't convince the apostles, the possible exception of John. But across the board, it didn't convince anybody. They did not believe Jesus rose from the dead until he appeared to them alive. Until that point, almost any explanation for an empty tomb by itself is preferable to the idea that somebody rose from the dead. Now, most of these theories have other problems as well, which we've pointed out, but most of them also do stumble over this fact. They are unable to account for the post-resurrection appearances. Ones like the hallucination theory do, but they don't work for other reasons.
What's your next theory to debunk?
The next one, the identical twin theory, which simply posits that Jesus had an identical twin brother, and after Jesus was killed, the identical twin took his place, and that's why people thought he rose from the dead.
Sounds like a movie.
Even for a movie, I'm not sure a producer would take a chance on something like that, because this is more than just reaching. And the more you look into it, the crazier it becomes, for so many reasons. First, in Mark chapter 6, we see Jesus visit to the town of Nazareth in which he grew up. And this happens from Mark chapter 6, verses 1 to 6. Then he went out from there and came to his own country, and his disciples followed him. And when the Sabbath had come, he began to teach in the synagogue. And many hearing him were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? And what wisdom is this which is given to him, that such mighty works are performed by his hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" So they were offended at him. But Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor, except in his own country, among his own relatives, and in his own house." Now he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them, and he marveled because of their unbelief. So this is the point here. The locals knew Jesus' family. They would have known about a twin brother, which would then immediately have been brought up to discredit the resurrection claims.
Of course.
In fact, the only way this could have gone down is if Joseph and Mary had squirreled away the twin brother in the basement. Wait, they had no basements in those days. So squirreled him away somewhere right from the very beginning, from the moment he was born, and then kept him hidden for 33 years. And Jesus couldn't have planned this because he'd just been born. It's got to be the parents. Why would they do this? And how are they going to sell it to the brothers? Wow, I can just see this. Son, we've kept you hidden and you're going to stay hidden for 33 years. So we convince your brother to let himself get killed. You're going to jump out and pretend to be him. And to Jesus, they say, son, we've got this plan here where you're going to go out and preach. And in 33 years, you're going to agree to die on a cross and be put to death. And then your brother, after being hidden for 33 years, is going to pop out and take your place. I'd love to see them trying to sell that to the two brothers. Let's cast out the idea of how ridiculous this is just for the moment and assume it could have happened. It still wouldn't have worked. Because if they did do this, how long would the twin brother have fooled the apostles? I would say not very long at all. He might have looked physically like Jesus, although you find as twins get older, they do tend to diverge somewhat in appearance. But he might have looked like him physically, but there would be two problems here. One, they have no shared experiences. Every time the apostles would say to him, oh, Jesus, remember that time when we were in Capernaum and this happened? And the twin brother would be like, huh? Very quickly, they would figure out this guy has not gone through any of these things with us. It can't be Jesus. And the other problem is they may have looked similar physically, but the twin brother wouldn't have had those marks. He wouldn't have had the holes in the wrists and in the feet where the nails went in and the big gaping hole in his side where the Roman spear went in. So they wouldn't have been able to pull this off.
That suggestion is frankly embarrassing.
Yes, but it does show the desperate lengths to which some people will go to avoid facing the reality of Jesus' resurrection.
I hope the next theory is better.
Afraid not. And the next theory is the magic mushroom theory.
It's a hallucination again? Magic mushroom?
It is sort of, but here's how it goes. Jesus never existed, you see, according to this theory. The stories of Jesus were concocted by people who were high on psychoactive mushrooms. And there's a variation of this theory as well that says that Jesus did exist, but it was just an ordinary fellow who used the mushrooms to get people into an altered state of consciousness, and then essentially hypnotized them into believing that he had risen from the dead.
How do you respond to that?
Well, we can point out that actually even liberal scholars think this one is nuts. So you're in fact very unlikely to encounter it. But if you do, point out that the disciples would have been convinced of things that had never actually happened. So when they stood in front of the crowd on Pentecost saying, men of Israel, hear these words, Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves also know, him being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God, you have taken by lawless hands, have crucified and put to death, whom God raised up, having loosed the pains of death, because it was not possible that he should be held by it. Could you imagine what would have happened if the magic mushroom theory were true and they stood up and said this? People would be saying, wait, what? There's no such person. We didn't take anyone by lawless hands. Nobody was here doing miracles, wonders, and signs. What are you talking about? There was no Jesus of Nazareth. There was no crucifixion. Oh, they must have gotten into those shrooms again. The message would never have been taken seriously and spread. There never would have been a Christianity. It was just some drug-induced idea that had no correspondence to external reality.
Any other crazy theories?
Well, yes, there is the hot tomb theory. And this idea is his body was put into the tomb. It got so hot in there, the body vaporized. And so when the apostles, the women and the apostles came, they saw the empty tomb and they thought Jesus rose.
Wow, that is totally impossible, of course. You would imagine all the tombs are empty because everybody would be vaporizing in there.
But why is it impossible?
Well, because as the temperature went up and up, the body would eventually get cremated, not vaporized. There would be remains, a pile of ashes, and you'd need to get up to a minimum of at least 760 degrees Celsius for starts cremation. There's no way the tomb could become that hot.
Exactly. And again, this doesn't explain the post-resurrection appearances. So this is an illustration of what I was talking about. The theories, most of them don't explain the post-resurrection appearances, but they fail on other grounds as well. But once again, this theory shows that skeptics are willing to cross into the realm of lunacy to avoid facing the truth of Jesus' resurrection.
What else?
There's the substitution theory held by many Muslims. They believe that Jesus could not actually have been crucified. As the Quran says this in Surah 4, 157 to 158. And they're saying, surely we have killed the Messiah, Isa, son of Maryam, the apostle of Allah, and they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but it appeared to them so. And most surely those who differ therein are only in a doubt about it. They have no knowledge respecting it, but only follow a conjecture, and they killed him not for sure. Nay, Allah took him up to himself. So according to this passage, Jesus was not crucified, but it looked to them as if he had been crucified. And so Muslims have to explain how that could have been the case. And this is probably the most common explanation they have, that as Jesus was about to be crucified, God snatched him up to heaven and made somebody else look like Jesus. The usual candidate is Judas, and the Romans crucified Judas, but everybody thought it was Jesus. Now, this could possibly be an alternate explanation if Jesus hadn't really been crucified, and then the real Jesus could have been seen walking around later, leading to the belief they had risen from the dead. But even Muslims won't say this because the passage says that Jesus was taken up right away. Allah took him up to himself. So if he's taken up at that moment, he's not around to be walking around later, convincing people he had risen from the dead. Furthermore, this is a faith position. There's no evidence to support it, and it would mean that Jesus was a false prophet, as his crucifixion and resurrection were what he pointed to as proof of himself. Muslims may say, well, we can't trust what the Bible says on these things. However, there are very, very strong historical evidences to support the truth of the Bible. And what you have in the Quran are uncorroborated claims from about 600 years after the fact. And uncorroborated claims 600 years after the fact really cannot override independent eyewitness testimonies that we find in the New Testament.
Any more?
One more, the space aliens theory. And this one has space aliens coming in and removing the body of Jesus. They don't generally talk about post-resurrection appearances. However, I suppose they could say that the little green men took on the form of Jesus and walked around a bit.
You're kidding.
No. And this is a non-starter too. There's solid historical evidence for the death and resurrection of Jesus. There's no evidence of any sort for the existence of space aliens. So anyone suggesting this theory needs to first provide such evidence before we even begin to consider it.
So which theory do you think is best?
When you consider all things, you find that there's actually only one that fits the evidence and explains all of the facts. And that is the theory that Jesus Christ was crucified on the cross. He was dead and buried. He was raised alive again the third day in his physical body and appeared to the apostles and to many others during 40 days, showing himself alive by many infallible proofs, thus proving himself to be God the Son and Savior, the only one who can save us from our sins and give us everlasting life. And you can come up with any kind of cockeyed theory to avoid facing that reality, but it is the reality. And I would urge everyone to come to grips with that and make a decision regarding Jesus.
Well, I think that's a pretty comprehensive list of cockeyed theory. I believe that if anybody is objective and really want to look into evidence, and there is no way that they can say Jesus did not rise from the dead based on historical evidence, based on the same standard that they would use on other historical facts and historical books. Thank you for talking to us about the theories, debunking the theories, and about the arguments for the resurrection.
It was a pleasure. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. If you like our content, please share this information with family and friends. It helps us a lot. We also would love to hear from you. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by searching Truth in My Days as one word again. Truth in My Days as one word. No spaces in between. Or reach us by email at info@truthinmydays.com. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.